Elka Solomon.
There are some things you never forget. My father was a sheet metal worker, AFL-CIO number 292, a fellow traveler, and a labor organizer. My mother was a secretary. I learned to cook because I had to. When we moved from the center of Detroit to the outskirts of suburban Oak Park, I was the one who cooked. I didn't have to hunt and gather, but I had to make meals for my parents and siblings. The kitchen was in the basement. It was finished. And it was there that I made the most disgusting beef liver. Smelly, bloody, slimy, disgusting. Its ugliness got uglier if I fried it too long. It would turn green. I also made an iceberg salad with Thousand Island dressing, watered down Miracle Whip or mayo, and ketchup. Where Thousand Island comes from, I have no idea, except it's conceivable that it was the relish that I didn't put in. But Thousand Islands, as you probably know, are in the St. Lawrence River. I made mashed potatoes. I opened a can of veggies, and that 50s staple Jello. And I opened up, sometimes, a can of fruit cocktail with heavy syrup. I love the cherries. We all lived through it. That was my home. So, a couple years later in Ann Arbor, at school, I was cooking in my co-op. The co-op got a violation because the cook, Mawa, was sticking her fingers in all the food to taste it. By then, I could cook for 30 people easily. Sheet cakes, cookies, variations on stews and casseroles. I made veggies, canned no more. The sequence was canned, frozen, invented by Dr. Birdseye, and fresh. Things change. After college and recently married, I bought liverwurst. We had very few funds. And a couple years later, After graduate school, I was cooking my way through Mastering the Art of French Cooking by Julia Child, the British paperback version, Volume 1. Everybody did it. We didn't know. Butter, butter, and more butter. Or salt, salt, and more salt, as my nephew Jesse would say, who's a chef. Well, things change again. And with marriage number 1 over, I embarked on a new life. And my relationship to food also changed. When Michael, husband number 2, and I had Alex, son, we decided early on that it was necessary to have dinner together. It was important, it was essential, given what we had learned growing up. Being a TAVOLA, a table, there was no joy. And I was reminded by my first in-laws that being at table should be a joy. They were exuberant. And so we finally understood, or I finally understood, what I had been missing. The table, a TAVOLA, is a place for social relations. It's the point at which the external nature of etiquette meets the internal nature of ethics. It's where every child learns good manners. Manners have always formed, historically, a part of every child's education. And unless you were really detached from society, you learned. So a peasant would come to a table with a spoon and those manners and eat gruel, gruel, and more gruel. At least our son learned how to use a knife and fork. The fork came to the West from Byzantium in the 11th century, and in Italian cities by the 14th century, they were using it to both serve and to eat. They were made from all kinds of things. Now, let me digress for a moment. I hate bad manners. They piss me off. Don't chew with your mouth open. Don't pick your teeth with your fingers. Don't pick your nose. Don't lean. Don't put your elbows on the table. Don't taste something and put it back on your plate. Like, you know, when you take a chocolate out of a sampler box and you eat the bottom of it and you put it back, and then you take another one until you find the one you really like. Coughing and sneezing that gets saliva all over the place should be avoided. Don't push your plate towards the server, and don't complain about the food being offered. Some people, mostly Michael's family, would leave the table before all of the food was served. The men usually would leave to go look at some sporting event and leave the rest of us to finish eating and to clean up. Michael's mother was an extraordinary woman, and I adored her. She was the perfect role model, except when she ate. She would chew and talk and spit simultaneously. She would make a mess. It was a food storm, and we felt we had to vacuum her when she was finished. The three of us learned to navigate the table, and the consistency with which we did sit at table together helped our son get a good base. So the conversations that he listened to and joined helped him create a critical mind to ask what his place was in the world. We talked and shared and loved and ate together. I love fake. I use fake stuff whenever I can. Like Pam, you know that stuff that you spray on your cooking tin so nothing sticks? Fabulous. I also adore fake sugar. And I use it every time a recipe calls for sugar. What is all this about? No calories, no carbos, no fat, no sugar. It's all about being thin? We're obsessed by food, good or bad. You realize we're a diet nation. I don't know, but I think that it's about denying pleasure and taste and texture. And that's why I use it, so I can have some pleasure eating a piece of chocolate cake or a lemon custard. I make the best lemon custard that you'll never have. Fake sugar, fake eggs, fake milk, skim milk, really. And I feel really virtuous. Virtue? Some people are concerned with genetically modified food. There's really no proof that there are any deleterious effects, said the carrot. Is process good or bad? Where does it begin and where does it end? What about Velveeta and tater tots and Cheese Whiz and sausage or tuna fish canned or even dried pasta? Well, guess what? Fat has a bad rap too. It implies sloth and laziness and lack of effort and blubber. I'll have none of that. Lack of the stuff also implies no boobs, no tush, and maybe a little bit of muscle. How come we hate our bodies so, all that extra weight? We moralize as we eat. We moralize as we eat. For years, we dismissed French cooking, all that extra butter and cream. How come French women don't get fat? And we're an obese nation too. How can we be both an obese nation and a diet nation at the same time? Good question, huh? There used to be, this is historical, there used to be 115 kosher delis in New York City, including the 5 boroughs. Now there are only about 30. What have I done? What has happened to all of these wonderful places? The Diet Health Nation helped get rid of them. Alan King, one of my favorite comedians, said, "Nobody ever died from having a pastrami sandwich once a month." And I think he's right. Did you ever read an obit that somebody OD'd on a pastrami sandwich? And let me ask you, would the world be a better place without pastrami? In New York City, people seem to go to restaurants as if they were shrines. They go there because of the buzz that's created by the New York Times or the stars given by Michelin Guide or Zagat. They've been created for the hot spot of the moment. They seem to be shrines or the food seems to be the religion to the point of unsubstantiated moralizing. We bow down to the new, we bow down to the new old, to the old new, to scenes that are created by restaurants who want to astonish us with their combinations and deconstructions. They only seem to make me think that the food is being reconstructed and sensationalized. These restaurants are expensive and exclusive. And I wonder if the people who go there are ever hungry. Hunger. How do we beat the problem of poverty and hunger? Well, I guess what we do is we have the hungry eat the poor. The best way to beat hunger is food. There are so many organizations that feed the hungry in New York every day. Some provide counseling and referrals for overnight stays or longer stays, like the SROs of years ago. Some of them also collect food that's already prepared from high-end restaurants. They are connected to distribution centers that sometimes are also connected directly to manufacturers. Others actually make food and deliver it to the old and the sick. If you're not homeless, you probably got one of these. And maybe you tore it up, or maybe you didn't read it. But I'm going to read it to you. More than 20% of New York City residents live in poverty. Nearly a third of all Bronx seniors live in poverty and must choose between putting food on the table and paying for necessities like medicine or heat. Because of the high cost of living in New York City, we must earn nearly 3 times the federal poverty level just to meet all their needs. Some agencies, like City Harvest, provide food for 400 food programs. This is half the number of food programs in New York City, and to all of the food kitchens as well. It would appear that these homeless and hunger organizations have it knocked. They don't. They have to raise their own funds. They have staffs and they have paid workers. They might have deep-pocketed institutions and individuals, or they get donations from people like us, but they really also are dependent on lots and lots of volunteers. As much as they do, they come nowhere near addressing the underlying problem, which is poverty. They feed the hungry, they deal with the homeless, but do not deal with the obstinate poverty in this country. They provide for the homeless and the hungry ameliorative and critical services. But they're not set up, nor is their mission to deal with this poverty. Remember Jelly Bean Regan? He was the one who said a vegetable was ketchup for the kids' lunches. The government has been left off the hook since that time. And just the other day, $40 billion was cut from the food stamp program. And even our dear little health mayor didn't allow people to oversize their sodas. Not a big deal, there's always a way around that. And he decided that some people, read poor ethnic people, needed to eat fresh vegetables. That is, he didn't want them to eat their fatty, sugary comfort food. So now we have zoning for vegetables, for fresh vegetables. You get a whole extra floor on your new building if you have a grocery store that sells fresh vegetables. Ever been to a market in Chinatown or Flushing? Not exactly upscale. Aside from being really a goofy use of zoning, how are you going to enforce people to buy fresh vegetables? One study has shown that they're too expensive. And the same study has shown if vegetables are subsidized or their price is lowered, they buy vegetables. This goofiness also has a possibility of being racist because he seems to be targeting neighborhoods where Caribbean and Southern blacks and Latinos live. Let me share a few things with you. Having worked in soup kitchens like Holy Apostles, where they serve 1,000 lunches every single day of the year. Volunteers from the LGBT synagogue volunteer there, other churches volunteer there, and a soup kitchen that I directed. One day, this server said to a client, "I don't care if you're allergic to peanut butter. Take your soup and move on." Another time, another server in another soup kitchen said, when the client asked for salt, "This doesn't need salt. It's perfect." Was she saying, "Take this and lump it"? Or was she being kind by saying, "Salt's bad for you, you shouldn't eat it"? Or was she saying, "You got this for free, and you didn't do anything to get it"? Now, this is really an example of the customer being always right, right? The boundaries, it seems, between hunger and homelessness are very close. Too many people right now are living on the edge. Too many people are losing self-esteem and are being shunned. These places, these wonderful soup kitchens, service the hungry, but not a TAVOLA. That is, you eat with strangers, but the social component of your life is gone. To a man with an empty stomach, food is God. Did you know that there are an inordinate number of foul jokes? I'll tell you one. This woman walked into a butcher store and asked for a Long Island duckling. Butcher goes to the refrigerator, brings out a bird, gives it to the woman, says, stups her hand up to tuchus, And she says, "This isn't a Long Island duckling. This is from Minneapolis." I'm so sorry. I'm really sorry. Goes back to the refrigerator, comes back with another bird. "What are you doing?" "This is from Wyoming." This goes on and on and on. Finally, a Long Island duckling. Oh, it's gorgeous. "I'll take it." She gives it to the butcher. Butcher's defeathering it, processing it, and she gets a little more relaxed. She says, "What's your name?" Says, "Irving." "Where are you from?" "You tell me." Am I going to go to Queens to get that fresh chicken? Or am I going to go down the block to the supermarket where they sell organic? Organic, schmorganic. Is it a hoax? In some cases, it really can be. But for chickens, I don't know. You realize that only 2% of the chickens we consume are free range. They should have a nice life while they're here. They're being bred to die. Let them run around. Let them have room. It's good. It's good for them. Don't feed them crap. Don't feed them arsenic. Don't feed them antibiotics. And really, do I want to eat a chicken that's on the same antidepressant that I am? So, which chicken do I buy? Turns out, and this is interesting, that New Jersey was a veritable hen house of Jewish chicken farmers. Survivors from World War II started farms there, and their prosperity peaked in the 1950s. This was short-lived because industrial farming and the price of real estate rocketed. So they had to either sell their land or become real estate developers. I once did a project about fresh chickens. There are about 90 live animal markets in New York City in the 5 boroughs. They sell goats and ducks and rabbits, but mostly chickens. I went to the one down on Thompson Street, closed. Then I went to the one on Delancey Street, closed. Gentrification. So then I got smart and I started calling people to make sure that they were open. I called Brooklyn and I asked this woman, whom I got on the telephone, "Do you sell live chickens?" And she said, "Lady, if you want a live chicken, go to a pet store." It really happened. It really happened. The markets are neatly divided by ethnicity. Most of them killed the chickens in the same way, but they don't approach the chicken similarly. Some of them just approach the chicken carefully and calmly, each cage, so that the chicken is just much more docile. Like, "Hello, little chickie. How did the American chickie cross the road?" "In a bucket." This is not the place where they raise the animals. This is a store. Do we know what they're fed? Usually what the customer does is walk around this large space where there are lots of cages. And they look at each of the animals until they find the right one. And then she says, and it's taken to the back slaughter room where its neck is slit and the blood is drained down a hole. Chicken is processed, basically, cleaned, feathered, cleaned, packaged, wrapped, and given to the customer. This takes only 15 minutes. It's the choosing that takes the longest. Then it's home, to where the chicken meets the other ingredients that are going to make a meal. So, chicken is the main dish. What am I going to make with it? Antipasti, primo, then the main. Order. I could also just put it all on the table. But this menu refers to the French, as well as being at a table that's fixed, has a place in a room, a TAVOLA. So antipasti can be a mix, a little old with a little new, piece of bread with a shtickle veg, maybe even something more complicated like fried zucchini or caponata. Now, refrigerators have changed the way women shopped and cooked. You used to have to shop every single day because the food wouldn't keep. Now, clearly, food stays for more than a day. Without a refrigerator, foods were fermented and dried and salted and canned. And the introduction of new gadgets and appliances saved many hands and many, many days of work that we no longer have. So preparing dinner for me allows me to experiment with different cuisines. Is that a class word? Can eating be classist? The food becomes a segue into another culture. So we can figure out concepts of wealth and property in the kitchen. We can tell if a man was poor, his wife and daughter would cook the meal. Can eating be sexist? If the man of the house was rich, slaves or servants did the work. We could also calculate how many slaves or servants were in the back in the kitchen by how beautiful the food being presented was. How much does it cost? How long did it take to make? What are the foods that are specific to this culture? Most days, I cook Italian. But I also recently have begun to cook Middle Eastern and Moroccan food. It's very labor-intensive food, and it really tells you how much, it tells you a lot about the culture and also about the role of women in that culture. Okay, more vegetables. I have to finish shopping for Friday night. I have the fortune of going to Italy most summers and realize that some food is not available all the time. It's site-specific, season-specific. And for example, fish is only available on Friday. I live in the mountains. Since things are not necessarily available, we go to the supermarket, where everything is available most of the time. When I shop, I like a good bargain and a good find. And if I have a list according to what I want to make, I sometimes am disappointed because I find something fabulous at a good price. So when I'm on the Upper West Side, I do a drop into Zabar's or Fairway. And if I'm in Chinatown, there's always fish and fresh vegetables. And if I'm near Port Authority, there's the meat market and a greengrocer. There are differences. In Italy, there are farms everywhere. Even in this little town that I live in, there's a little industrial park. And there's a garden in between these two buildings. Here, farmers can come from as far as 200 miles and still be considered local. Their produce is gorgeous. But as I said earlier, some people can't afford them. So it's of course clear that we're having chicken for Friday night. And I love using the whole chicken. I hate waste. So what I do frequently is I take the little bits of leftover bone and chicken or whatever and make a stock out of it and freeze it. It's like the opposite of bone to tail. It's after you eat. No waste. Thrilling. One of my heroines is Marion Cunningham. She was a woman who brought real respect to the home cook. She demystified the language of cooking, especially for those who had never cooked before. I always interpreted that as if you can read, you can cook. She was a Californian, little known on the East Coast, and she was James Beard's cooking assistant for 11 years. But before that, for the first half of her adult life, she lived in Walnut Creek and was the perfect housewife, homemaker, and mother. She was somewhat agoraphobic and, like her father, alcoholic. She had heard in 1972, at the age of 50, that James Beard was giving a class in Oregon. She desperately wanted to go. So her two friends, two of her very dear friends, got her on an airplane. It was the first time out of California, and brought her to Oregon. From that moment on, her life changed. The moment she got into Beard's class, the alcoholism was gone. So she was Beard's assistant for 11 years because she was already such a fine cook. And she was at the right place at the right time because it was the moment when regional food, organic vegetables, and a new way of eating and cooking in America was taking over. She was hired on Beard's recommendation to not only edit, but rewrite the Fannie Farmer cookbook. It was a cookbook for homemakers. Now, I want to read you something that she said in the Fannie Farmer cookbook. No one is cooking at home anymore, so we're losing all the wonderful lessons we learn at the dinner table. We're losing an important value. Food is more than fodder. It is an act of giving and receiving, because the experience at table is a communal sharing. Talk begins to flow, feelings are expressed, and a feeling of well-being takes over. She gave legitimacy to home cooking, and she took housewife food and really gave it respect. So, home cooking is sometimes known as comfort food. And we know that it can be particularly awful on one hand and terrifically inventive on the other hand. My favorite is when some immigrant groups prepare food with the eye of their new home. For example, my peanut butter and jelly sandwich. It was prepared on cornbread, pumpernickel, rye bread, or even challah. I was so embarrassed that my PB&J was different because I was dying to have it on Wonder Bread. There can be a contradiction also in comfort food, and that is it's the cooking of the poor. For example, Eastern European cooking is bread and potatoes and salt and schmaltz, chicken fat. It could kill you or could eat into your lifespan. This is not food about health. This is food that is tasty and is familiar. And it's not about the food being served. It's about where it's being served and how it's being served. It's the food of memory. Of people who are about to die, their last bites frequently give comfort, and their caregivers are happy to have it. I've had a morbid fascination with the last foods of condemned prisoners. Heavy on calories, heavy on meat, and seems prisoners are more likely to choose soda over milk. They range from lobster shore dinners to canned spaghetti. For example, Timothy McVeigh had 2 pints of Ben & Jerry chocolate chip ice cream. Who knew? Now, before I leave Marion, I want to tell you something she said in the Fanny Farmer cookbook. How do you crack a coconut? One cracks a coconut by throwing it on a cement patio. Monkeys do it that way, and they're the professionals. So, Shabbat. On Friday nights, when Alexander was old enough, we started making Shabbat. We did it so he would understand his origins. And we did it when he was young enough to understand the meaning. We would invite friends over and who would enjoy this event, who would participate with us and would be happy to eat and drink with us. A couple of days ago, Tom and his family, not days, a couple of months ago, sorry, came over with his family. They were disappointed that we had shortened our ritual. I mean, after all, Alexander is now 34 years old and is not home every Friday night. But they had already told their friend about this ritual, and so convinced us to do it again. And the only thing, actually, that we didn't do was have the children, now 27, run as we used to, from one end of the room to the other end of the room, into our arms, twirling about, singing, Shabbat Shalom, Shabbat Shalom, Shabbat, 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 Shabbat Shalom. So there are lots of questions about whom to invite with whom. Can I invite a recently divorced man with a single woman without it looking like a setup? Or can I invite uptown with downtown when I know their politics are so different and they're so outspoken? And what about East Side with West Side? Sometimes when I make up a list of whom to invite, I could feel now and then that the only way to have a social life is to invite people over. And I decided that this came from second wave feminism that gave us or brought us a kind of neurotic and competitive way to cook. It is, we wanted to excel in everything. Not only did we want instant gratification, but we wanted applause and control. And Nora Ephron said at that time that we wanted to be all things to all people. The menu mix, as you realize, is dependent on the company. Can I invite a vegetarian with an omnivore? The vegetarians eat animal crackers. That's a possibility. Now, 20 years ago, I didn't have to think about silica and gluten and vegan and vegetarian and lactose. Now, I have to take everybody's pulse so they won't plotz at my table or be deeply offended. It's not like I'm feeding the hordes. It's like feeding our friends. And feeding our friends is the most personal thing I can do. Where we eat is dependent on how many and who. And so our stable table seats 8 quite comfortably, and everybody can talk to one another or talk to the person across for them or next to them. The space is very intimate. And if we're in the kitchen, it has to feel just right. The kitchen used to be at the back of the house. The cook was invisible, and now it's a center for social activity. After each of these meals, we do a post-mortem. I never want to hear from somebody, from these 2 women whose conversation I overheard. Salt and pepper. She says, the food was disgusting. Bleach blonde, you're right, but there wasn't enough. So I got to end this with something. Sometimes it's just fruit compote or some cookies or a little tart. Dessert is really not necessary, but we're hardwired to want something sweet. But that is another story. Sometimes, or actually most times, I'm wiped by the end of these meals, and I frequently disappear into our bedroom and go to sleep. But usually I wait until after dessert, and when people are hanging around and we're all just talking, and the digestivi and the cigars come out, and then I disappear. Alexander once said to a lovely young woman, "Oh, don't worry, my mom sometimes disappears. It's okay, she's going to sleep." I serve just desserts. And I'm out of here. Come and have some wine and food.